European royal families are often portrayed as obsessively protective of bloodlines, legitimacy, and ancestral purity. Their genealogies appear polished and complete, yet closer inspection reveals something strange. Across multiple dynasties, especially when maternal lines are traced, key figures emerge with limited or unclear origins. Queens and royal consorts frequently appear in historical records only at the moment they become politically useful, while their earlier lineage fades into silence. This pattern raises an uncomfortable question. If royal blood was truly sacred, why do so many foundational maternal lines remain poorly documented? Rather than isolated oversights, these gaps appear repeatedly across different empires. At the same time, early European maps consistently depict a vast region known as Tartary, stretching from Central Asia into Siberia, complete with cities, trade routes, and centers of authority. Then, within a relatively short period, during the 18th century, Tartary disappears from maps altogether, replaced by emerging empires with little documented transition. Adding to the puzzle are striking similarities in imperial architecture and symbolism. Palaces across Europe and Asia share proportions, design logic, and recurring symbols, such as the double-headed eagle, suggesting a shared language of power rather than coincidence. This video explores the possibility that European royal houses may not be separate bloodlines at all, but surviving branches of an older ruling system, later renamed, reorganized, and woven into modern history. By examining genealogy, cartography, architecture, and symbolism, we begin asking how legitimacy was preserved and what may have been deliberately forgotten. If this investigation interests you, consider liking the video, subscribing for future episodes, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. When people talk about European royal family trees, they are often described as among the most reliable historical records ever created. Dynasties such as the Habsburgs, Romanovs, Tudors, and Hanoverians are presented as meticulously documented bloodlines, with clear lines of succession, politically strategic marriages, and a sense of uninterrupted continuity stretching back centuries. On paper, these genealogies appear flawless, almost mathematical in their precision, reinforcing the idea that royal history is fixed, objective, and beyond question. However, when multiple royal family trees from the same historical periods are compared side by side, a subtle but consistent pattern begins to emerge. The paternal lines are recorded in extreme detail, tracing fathers, grandfathers, titles, lands, and political claims with obsessive care, while the maternal lines often fade into vagueness. Many women who entered royal families appear in the historical record with surprisingly shallow backgrounds, as if their documented histories only became detailed at the moment they became politically relevant. Before their marriages, their ancestry is often abbreviated, unclear, or missing from surviving records, creating an imbalance that feels difficult to explain if genealogy were purely about preserving historical accuracy. This imbalance leads to an uncomfortable question. Are royal family trees neutral historical records, or do they also function as tools that reinforce political legitimacy? If genealogy were treated equally in all directions, we would expect the same level of scrutiny for both paternal and maternal lines. Instead, what we often see is selective precision, where information that strengthens political legitimacy is preserved in detail, while information that complicates the narrative is simplified, shortened, or less emphasized. This does not necessarily mean history was fabricated, but it strongly suggests that it was curated, shaped not only to record the past, but to support authority in the present. This pattern becomes even more striking when examining royal marriages and the long-standing obsession with blood purity. European royal families consistently claimed that lineage, noble origin, and legitimacy were paramount, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries, when marriages were portrayed as carefully calculated political maneuvers. Every alliance was supposedly scrutinized to ensure that bloodlines remained pure and power remained uncontested. Yet a clear paradox appears when we look closer. The very families that claimed to value blood purity above all else repeatedly accepted brides whose ancestry could not be fully traced, without leaving behind clear records of public debate, investigation, or resistance. In many cases, A woman's origin effectively became accepted as legitimate once was written into official records after her marriage. In an era where legitimacy determined political survival, this silence is notable. If ancestry truly mattered as much as royal rhetoric claimed, missing or unclear lineage might have raised serious concerns, yet instead it was absorbed into the system and quickly normalized. This opens the door to a difficult hypothesis. Certain origins may have been selectively downplayed, not erased entirely, but softened when they did not align with dominant historical narratives. When power depends on continuity, inconvenient details do not need to disappear. They only need to stop being questioned, because once something is recorded as official history, it becomes accepted reality regardless of what came before. According to official history, the Romanov dynasty traced its legitimacy back to the ancient Rurik bloodline, a narrative consistently reinforced through court records, religious ceremonies, and meticulously documented successions. Russian imperial archives are famously detailed when it comes to rituals, marriages, titles, and the outward structure of power, creating the impression of an unbroken and well-understood lineage. On the surface, the Romanovs appear firmly rooted in Slavic and Orthodox tradition, positioned as the natural heirs to early Russian statehood. However, when researchers look beyond dominant historical narratives and into lesser-cited academic notes, regional studies, and marginal references, a more complex picture begins to emerge. These sources contain recurring references to possible Tatar origins within segments of the Russian nobility, including families closely connected to the Romanov court. Importantly, the term Tatar does not simply mean Mongol, as it is often oversimplified today. Historically, it functioned as a broad cultural and political classification, encompassing a diverse range of peoples, elites, and governing structures across Eurasia. In many contexts, it described administrators, military leaders, and aristocratic classes who were integrated into systems of power rather than existing solely as external forces. This is where the narrative begins to shift from dynastic genealogy to a broader historical context. The word Tatar appears repeatedly alongside a name that was once common on European maps but is now far less discussed: Tartary. Rather than a purely mythical concept, Tartary functioned for centuries as a geographical, political, and cultural designation in European cartography. The presence of references to Tatar ancestry in Russian noble lines suggests continuity alongside conquest, raising the possibility that what later became the Russian Empire absorbed, reclassified, or inherited structures that predated it. At this point, the discussion moves beyond a single royal family and begins pointing toward a larger, often overlooked framework of power across Eurasia. From the 16th through the 18th centuries, European maps produced in France, the Netherlands, and England consistently depicted Tartary as an extensive territory spanning much of Central and Northern Asia. These were not merely decorative or speculative maps, but commercial and military documents intended for navigation, trade planning, and strategic decision-making which required practical accuracy. Tartary was not illustrated as an empty wilderness. It was shown as a structured land with cities, trade routes, defined borders, and centers of authority, often labeled with terms implying governance, courts, and administration. What makes this especially notable is how the name Tartary gradually disappears from these maps. By the late 18th century, the label begins to be replaced by the territorial names of expanding powers, such as the Russian Empire, King China, and the Ottoman Sphere. This transformation occurs relatively quickly, and with limited transitional documentation. There are no widely cited records detailing the dissolution of a Tartarian political entity, nor comprehensive accounts explaining how such a vast and organized region was redefined within a short historical span. Instead, Tartary appears to fade from official usage through processes of reclassification. The land remains, populations remain, and the infrastructure implied by earlier maps does not vanish overnight. Yet the name and identity gradually disappear from mainstream historical narratives. This lack of explicit explanation invites further scrutiny. Empires often decline through conflicts, treaties, and visible political rupture. In contrast, Tartary seems to have been absorbed into new political identities without clear acknowledgement of what preceded them. When viewed alongside references to Tatar ancestry within ruling elites, including those connected to the Romanovs, the disappearance of Tartary appears less like the loss of a civilization and more like a shift in how geopolitical memory was organized. What was once openly labeled in maps and administrative language gradually fell out of use, not necessarily because it was insignificant, but because it no longer aligned with emerging frameworks of modern statehood. In this sense, Tartary was not erased by force, but by omission, becoming absent from history through the act of no longer being named. On old European maps, Siberia was not presented as an empty frontier at the edge of civilization. It was consistently shown as part of the broader Tartarian space, integrated into a vast geographical and political framework rather than isolated from it. These maps, created long before modern exploration narratives took hold, indicate that Siberia was understood as inhabited, organized, and economically connected to surrounding regions. What makes this especially notable is how Russian territorial expansion records describe early encounters in Siberia. Rather than portraying untouched wilderness, explorers and administrators documented structured cities, stone-built constructions, and organized communities with established trade networks. These were not temporary camps or purely nomadic outposts, but settlements described as displaying permanence, planning, and social order. Such descriptions stand in contrast to the modern historical image of Siberia as a frozen, sparsely populated land awaiting development. Yet when we search for these cities today, they are difficult to clearly identify. Many of the settlements mentioned in early records lack firmly established archaeological attribution, receive limited attention in mainstream history books, and are rarely examined in depth by modern scholarship. This creates a significant gap between what old maps and early documents describe, and what official narratives now emphasize. The absence is not subtle, it is structural. Either these cities were recorded in ways that are no longer easily traceable, or they existed and were later absorbed, dismantled, or reclassified in ways that reduced their historical visibility. In either case, the limited discussion surrounding them raises more questions than it answers. During the 18th century, an extraordinary wave of palace construction and large-scale renovation took place across Europe and Asia. The Winter Palace in Russia, Schönbrunn Palace in Austria, Buckingham Palace in England, the Royal Palace of Madrid, and major sections of the Forbidden City in China were all built or dramatically expanded within a relatively narrow historical window. These projects are usually explained as independent expressions of national power, driven by local monarchs and architects responding to regional tastes. However, when these structures are compared closely, striking similarities become apparent. They share mathematical proportions, spatial principles designed to convey authority, and remarkably consistent large-scale construction approaches. The experience of power they create is not accidental. It is shaped through symmetry, scale, and controlled movement through space. Despite being attributed to different architects with distinct cultural backgrounds, the underlying architectural logic appears more unified than fragmented. What is often less clearly addressed in standard narratives is how this knowledge circulated so widely. The names of architects are preserved, but the origins of the shared principles they employed receive comparatively little attention. There is limited discussion of centralized architectural theory, and no single, clearly documented pathway explaining how complex design concepts spread so rapidly across political and cultural boundaries. This gap suggests the possibility of a shared architectural language of power, one that extended beyond individual empires and continued even as political structures changed. Seen alongside the gradual disappearance of Tartary from maps and the reduced historical focus on early Siberian settlements, these palaces may represent more than national ambition alone. They may reflect remnants of a broader system of elite knowledge, inherited, adapted, and reinterpreted as new empires rose, while the original framework that shaped it faded from prominence in historical memory. Across European and Eurasian empires, certain royal symbols appear again and again with striking consistency. The double-headed eagle, specific crown designs, Recurring animal motifs and carefully controlled color schemes are found in Imperial Russia, the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium, and other centers of power that are officially described as separate civilizations. These symbols are often explained as aesthetic coincidence or cultural borrowing, but historically, they were not treated as mere decoration. They functioned as a visual language of power, communicating legitimacy, authority, and continuity to those familiar with their meaning. Symbols like these operated in ways comparable to written language. They signaled who held authority, who belonged to elite circles, and who did not. What makes this especially notable is that royal families often spoke different national languages, followed different religious traditions, and governed distinct territories, yet communicated efficiently in political contexts. This was possible because beyond spoken language, they shared a symbolic and cultural framework that extended across borders. In this sense, power recognized power regardless of nationality. If royal legitimacy was communicated visually and culturally through shared symbols, a natural question follows: whether that legitimacy also rested on shared ancestry. Today, modern data science is capable of tracing lineage, studying population relationships, and identifying genetic connections with extraordinary precision. It is routinely used in the study of ancient migrations, royal burials, and long-standing historical questions. And yet, there has never been a comprehensive, publicly accessible genetic study addressing Europe's major royal families as interconnected dynasties. This absence is notable. If royal bloodlines fully align with established historical narratives, genetic analysis would likely reinforce those claims and reduce speculation. Instead, data research related to royal ancestry remains fragmented, limited to isolated remains, partial case studies, or voluntary tests that do not form a broader comparative picture. The question, then, is not whether data could contribute to these discussions, but why it has not yet been applied in a systematic and transparent way. When power is inherited, uncertainty carries consequences. Data analysis does not engage with titles, ceremonies, or official records. It focuses on biological relationships. If such findings were to challenge established genealogies, the implications would extend beyond academic debate. At that point, history would become something open to empirical reassessment, rather than inherited assumption, a shift that institutions built on continuity have traditionally approached with caution. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, Europe experienced numerous catastrophic fires that destroyed palaces, archives, and administrative centers. These events are usually recorded as accidents or consequences of war, yet their historical impact was significant. Entire collections of land records, genealogies, legal documents, and diplomatic correspondence were lost. In many cases, these fires occurred during periods of political instability, contested succession, or territorial reorganization, moments when documentation was especially critical. What followed these losses is just as important as the fires themselves. Reconstruction did not only restore buildings, it reorganized records. New archives were assembled, new documents compiled, and new historical narratives formalized according to the governing structures of the time. Information that could not be verified was often omitted, while material that aligned with the emerging order was prioritized. Over time, these reconstructed records became the accepted historical baseline, while what was lost remained permanently uncertain. When viewed individually, each fire appears accidental. When viewed collectively, they reveal a recurring vulnerability in how historical records were preserved. The repeated loss of genealogical and territorial documentation meant that certain questions could no longer be conclusively resolved, only interpreted through surviving or reconstructed sources. This process did not require centralized coordination, only that stability was valued over unresolved ambiguity. When the patterns discussed so far are considered together, a broader hypothesis begins to emerge. Royal genealogies contain notable gaps, particularly along maternal lines. Maps change rapidly, removing regions such as Tartary without extensive transitional explanation. Architecture and imperial symbols reflect shared principles across borders. Genetic research capable of clarifying lineage remains incomplete, and records central to land, and bloodline claims repeatedly disappear at pivotal moments, later replaced by standardized narratives aligned with new political realities. Taken together, these observations suggest that Europe's royal families may not be entirely isolated dynasties with wholly separate origins, but interconnected branches of an older elite structure that once operated across much of Eurasia. Within this framework, Tartary appears less as a myth and more as a former organizing concept of power whose name and identity gradually fell out of use rather than being forcibly erased. What persisted was absorbed into emerging empires, redefined, and reinterpreted within the logic of modern nation-states. If this hypothesis holds even partially, then Tartary was not simply lost or forgotten, but transformed to fit a new political context. And history, as it is commonly understood today, may reflect not only independent empires rising in isolation, but the evolution of a shared system of power that adapted its language, symbols, and structure over time. If this made you think, hit like so more people see it, subscribe for the next part of this series, and leave a comment below with your perspective. History only stays unexplored when questions are no longer asked.